if your economic theory has no political implications, then it is completely useless. You may as well be writing Harry Potter. But obviously it has political implications. That's why you want the frickin' thing to be implemented. So I don't buy this case at all. And in fact, I think it's just complete hogwash.
Vaden, I feel like you're kind of not telling me what you really think. Can you maybe stop holding back?
So, welcome to our fourth and final episode on libertarianism with the excellent Mr. Bruce. Bruce, welcome back.
Thank you for having me.
So today we are going to try to stick the landing and conclude by talking about part C of Scott Alexander's piece, political issues. I think mainly, though, we're not going to hew to the text too much. I think mainly what we're going to talk about are kind of like meta issues associated with arguments that the critical rationalist form of libertarians tend to make, and how they will talk about their theory either being or not being a political theory, and the distinction that they draw between political theories and scientific ones. But to kind of start and kick things off, I'll just read the intro of part C, where Scott attempts to steelman the political side of things, and that'll just roughly set up what we're going to talk about today. What he says is, government can't do anything right. Its forays into every field are tinged in failure, whether it's trying to create contradictory state-owned businesses, funding pet projects that end up over budget and useless, or creating burdensome and ridiculous consumer protection rules. Its heavy-handed actions are always detrimental and usually embarrassing. The counterargument. Government sometimes, though by no means always, does things right, and some of its institutions and programs are justifiably considered models of efficiency and human ingenuity. There are various reasons why people are less likely to notice these.
I thought this was the worst of Scott's four sections,
really?
To be honest, by far.
I thought it was one of his strongest, but I would love to. Yeah. Great.
So I didn't have anything profound to say. I was just going to say that, we all know about government failures, right? I mean, like those hit the news and so it's really easy to think of things where government has just gone wrong. If I were to ask you, give me examples of where government's gone wrong just from the headlines last week, it would be really easy to give lots and lots of examples, right? Like some of them are startlingly bad. Just, election 2024 here in America, like the whole thing is startlingly bad. So you don't hear so much about, and I know this is Scott Alexander's argument, you don't hear so much about the successes. He lists out a lot of the successes and gives links and websites. And I didn't know, some of them I knew about at a high level, but it's kind of interesting to see just so many listed back to back, right? And just to see, here's one thing after another that the government has spot on done really well, just a partial quote. It goes on for so long with so many things. I can't really read it all, but eradicating smallpox and polio globally and cholera and malaria from this endemic areas in the US, inventing the computer, mouse, digital camera, and email, building the information superhighway and regular superhighway, delivering clean, practically free water and cheap on-the-grid electricity across an entire continent. I mean, he keeps going, right?
Yeah.
And somewhere in there, he mentions Doctor Who, which is one of my favorite shows growing up.
Yeah.
It was old when I started watching it as a kid, It was...
I've never actually seen Doctor Who. I really should watch it. I know it's like a legendary a show. But so the frequent asked questions kind of starts with government never does anything right. And then he just posts a big picture of the moon landing, which I thought was hilarious. But Ben, so if you weren't impressed with this section, I would love to know why. I think maybe why I was impressed was just because it takes a decent amount of work to compile a list like that of successes of government. And having that list is useful to hold in your back pocket when someone says that the government can never do anything right.
Yeah, no, it's not any disagreement actually with what he says. I think he's just off the mark with his argument. I just don't think many libertarians argue that government never does anything right. I've never seen that argument made, to be honest. It's mostly that government does things worse than private industry. So like the counterfactual being, if government hadn't tried to handle this problem, private industry would have done a better job, or this problem was solvable by private industry. So it just feels like a very weak argument in the sense that, you know, you have this like massive bureaucracy with a huge amount of money. It would be incredibly surprising if it never got anything right. Like that would be, we'd be in an entirely chaotic world. So like clearly it has the capability to do things. The interesting question is, had government not done this, what would have happened? What would have been the counterfactual? And so I much prefer arguments that deal with questions of incentives and market failures that say like, look, there's a fundamental problem with providing something like, e.g. basic research, that's going to be hard to do in something like an anarcho-capitalist system, and that government has a fundamental role to play here. And so arguments that deal like more causally with like, you know, just making claims that such and such would be impossible to get done by the private market, or would be much more difficult, as opposed to just like listing off things that the government does. Because then it's just like you get into this pissing contest where like, okay, well, now we're just going to list everything that the private market does. You know, you should think it's like, yeah, so moon landing was great. I think it spent, you know, $20 billion in 1960s money doing that. So I don't know how many, probably like $200 billion or something in today's dollars. So the question is, what was the counterfactual? Like if government hadn't been using that money, would private industry have put that money towards something more interesting, something better, etc.? And this section just doesn't deal with those sorts of arguments at all. And I think he does that much more in like economic issues, where you just deal with like root causes of, okay, here are things that are fundamentally going to be difficult for the private market to handle. And so I'm just much less impressed with the style of argumentation throughout this entire section. Honestly, I think he does the same thing in healthcare. He sort of just misses the actual argument that libertarians are making there. And so yeah, he still makes some interesting points, and there's some interesting history about like ARPANET and the internet and stuff that I hadn't known. So it's not that he's wrong. It's just that I don't think he's arguing against anyone.
Yeah. The charge is that it's a straw man, I guess, right? That
exactly
the way that he set up this section and what I read is not accurately describing the libertarian position, and I can't opine on that. So I actually would defer to Bruce or you. So if that's not accurate, then
Ben's mostly right here. Here's how it would typically be. Like, 'cause I've had so many arguments with libertarians over this. They do open with exactly what Scott Alexander is saying. Governments can never do anything right. Every single thing they do is wrong. They will open with arguments that are what we're now calling a straw man. So it can't be entirely a straw man in that they actually do use these arguments. However, when you argue against them, they will nuance it. And they will very, very, very quickly move to, you don't know what would have happened if that same money had been put into the market and the market had come up with what it was going to do. That would have been more valuable. That would have been more valuable if we hadn't gone to the moon and instead we had used that money to do something else and we had not charged taxes. And it would have been more valuable if, and that is always the argument that they go to at that point. And so Ben is getting that part right.
Yeah. Okay. So here's a question for you, Ben. And this is something that's come up just throughout our previous conversations. And I've never totally understood why you're so in love with counterfactuals. Because maybe in love is not the right phrase, but often your critique is they're not considering the counterfactual case. But if we just take, for example, the 20th century, there was a sequence of things that were accomplished that Alexander enumerated. So the going to the moon, the creation of the computer, the internet, the highway. And one could always say, well, you're not considering a counterfactual world where this was done better. And if you're always comparing it to a counterfactual things are done better, then I don't know, like, why is that such a valuable thinking tool? Like, what is the benefit of thinking?
Well, because you have to be able to think about stuff that isn't the status quo. Whenever you're thinking about like how to improve something or what other ways the world could be, how you want to improve it, you're always thinking about like what else could be done that hasn't been done before. And so the claim from libertarians is like, of course, governments gets things done because one, it has a lot of money, and two, it regulates the shit out of various private industries, and thereby maybe hamstringing them from getting things done more effectively than they could otherwise. And so I think, yeah, I think whenever you're imagining a solution to a problem, you're thinking counterfactually, like something's not working, and you're imagining like, okay, what else could we do here?
Okay, but so let's apply this concretely to the first example that he gives out, the eradication of smallpox. So the argument there from the libertarian side would be, well, if there was private companies that existed, they could have eradicated it faster. Like, from my perspective, it's like, who the fuck cares as long as it got eradicated? And at the time, there was only one entity that was powerful enough to distribute the vaccines across sub-Saharan Africa and stuff. And that was, I guess, was it the UN that did all that? Anyways, it was the public sector. And so why is it valuable to think, well, we could have done it even better if there were private companies 100 years ago, when we should just recognize that that was the thing that in fact got the job done. And should be something we update our views based off of, you know?
Well, no, it's just that if you're thinking about how to move forward and whether you want like more or less government across various industries, and then you're summoning, so say like you take public health, right? Take the FDA, and you're saying, okay, how much government involvement do we want here? How much regulation do we want? Do we want the UN and the World Health Organization in charge of distributing flu vaccines and eradicating every sort of pandemic that could possibly come up? Okay. So there's like a legitimate question there about like how we want to organize our society to handle those sorts of things. Then if you're summoning arguments like, oh, in the past, the WHO has successfully done such and such, then if we've only done something one way in the past, and then you use that as evidence that we should do it that way in the future, that's a totally vacuous argument, right? So you need to think about all possible alternative ways to do things, so like, so that we can figure out how to organize society in the future.
But I think there's a couple things being conflated there. So one is considering alternatives for future action is not counterfactual thinking. Factual thinking is only in the past, right? So something did happen, and
no, but it helps you think about counterfactuals. Like, it helps to think about how to solve future problems. It helps to think about counterfactuals. Like, okay, would this have worked in the past?
Yeah, for sure, it does sometimes. But on the eradicating smallpox example, it isn't. The argument isn't, well, government was successful in the past eradicating smallpox, so it's going to be great in the future building GPS. It's more that the point of the smallpox example is arguing against the opening burst of the libertarian case. So let's not describe it as a straw man or a steel man. Let's just say this is typically the first thing that they'll say, and then they'll go to the next level of the argument.
And that I agree with, but I'm just saying that's not the most. One, in my opinion, like most libertarians don't actually make those sorts of arguments. I guess Bruce has had a different experience, but that's fine.
Oh yeah.
But I don't think that's the most interesting. I don't think that's the most interesting libertarian argument to deal with. And so I was just slightly disappointed that that's the thing he chose to attack in this section. Like, sure, if people are making that argument, I agree. That's a bad argument. And then, of course, just listing a litany of things that government has done right is a totally valid counter argument to that claim. But I'm interested in dealing with like the best libertarian arguments because I want to try and figure out what's true, not just what's easy.
So let me throw something in here, though. Libertarians do not use these arguments evenly, right? They use it as weapons. So if they may say government does everything wrong, so you give them an example of government doing something right, in which case they will now use a counterfactual and they will say, oh yeah, but you don't know what would have happened if the market had solved it, it would have been better. Okay,
that's why I'm annoyed by the counterfactual stuff. Exactly. Yes. Yeah.
But we're not done yet, because then you can give them a real life example of where the market failed. You can point to Ireland famine, potato famine or whatever it was, where it was intentionally done. Let's let the market resolve this, and it turned into a mass famine. In which case they will say, but really, that problem existed because if you go back this many number of years, there's this problem that existed that was caused by governments. And so had you not had governments, counterfactually, had you not had governments, then that famine would not have happened. And they literally do that for everything. I call this the just so story, right? I mean, there's always this just so that the market magically would have taken care of this problem. And the degree to which they will go back is sometimes stunning, right? Like I was reading up one on the potato famine in Ireland I don't know what current libertarian thinking is on this. I'm sure it's better than the one I came across 10 years ago. But I literally was reading a web page trying to look into what they would say about this. And they said, oh, see, there was this war, and wars are caused by governments, and that was why there is this famine. And it's like, okay, look, if you're talking about, markets could take care of this. If we lived in a totally different world that didn't have wars, because even if wars are in fact caused by governments, which I don't know that that's the case, but even if I just assume that, the fact is that governments exist, wars exist, and if your market can't solve these problems that exist in the real world, that's really just the same as you can't solve these problems.
Can I just make a couple comments? So the made-up utopianism is exactly the thing that I was explaining far less articulately with my comments about the counterfactuals to Ben. But then, Ben, your point was a good one too, which is like, well, no, man, like when you're trying to think about the future, it often is a useful thinking tool to consider alternatives in the past and how outcomes could have been different if the conditions were different. And so that's a good point too. And so I guess it's just the use to which the counterfactual case is deployed. And if it's deployed just to ignore these quite strong counterexamples to your cherished view, then I think it's being employed or deployed rather, maybe in slightly a deceptive manner. But Ben, again, your point is a good one, which is like they don't only look at the bad uses of the counterfactual claim, consider their stronger cases, the stronger applications of it as well. And so I just want to square the circle and say that I totally agree with both of your points, and Bruce did a better job of explaining maybe the downsides of using counterfactuals, because you can always dismiss any example that way. That's the main thing. Yeah.
So there's no incompatibility between what Ben is saying and the Popperian incrementalist view, right? In fact, it's completely compatible with what Ben is saying when it's being deployed the way Ben's suggesting.
Yeah, sorry. So maybe let's just throw out the word counterfactual, because I think it's a little confusing maybe. So I'll just give you a concrete example of I think an argument that Scott could have made that I think would have been more interesting and maybe a little slightly more honest to the better libertarian position, which is something like, okay, currently government funds a lot of basic science, and we've seen that results in a lot of innovation. So this is where ARPANET and then eventually internet, email, etc. came from, right? This is also how a lot of vaccines were developed, a lot of tech, etc. Okay, so that's something government does right now via public funding for foundational science. And so that you can ask the question, what do libertarians, how do they imagine basic science being funded? What's the alternative here if government's not going to do it? Because it is slightly hard to believe that private companies, they'll be slightly unwilling to really spend a lot of money on pure R&D that doesn't have sort of immediate payoffs to whatever product they're producing, right? So it seems like that's that's difficult for the market mechanism to deal with. I think the libertarian answer to something like that, I'm actually not entirely sure what it is. And I think that's why criticism like that is valuable. But I think their answer is something like, actually, innovation comes from, it's not basic science first. You encounter problems in, say, the manufacturing sphere, and then you're incentivized to solve those problems to make your products faster, easier, better, etc. And then basic science arises out of that process of solving those problems. And so that's how science progresses. So instead of this view that we have now, where it's sort of government funds basic science and then basic science results in innovation and technology down the line, instead you have people trying to produce new technologies, they run into problems, and then they have to solve problems in basic science to get to develop newer and better technologies. And then you can have an argument about, is that true? Is that actually, could basic science be funded like that? Has basic science ever been funded like that? Where does most innovation actually come from? So anyway, that's an example of I think maybe dealing more slightly honestly with the libertarian position.
I have in my mind, this may not be true. You know how you carry lots of ideas in your mind and a lot of them are just false? Yeah. I was kind of under the impression that government funding for science started for the Manhattan Project, and they kind of continued it from there, and that prior to the Manhattan Project, that wasn't super common for governments to fund science.
Napoleon Bonaparte funded a lot of science. right?
Oh, I'm thinking America. I should have clarified. So I'm just thinking in America, what was our history? But you're right. Probably there's tons of funding of science outside of America. Okay.
And like what came out of that, Vaden? Do you know?
Like the metric system. I think things like canned goods during wartime also came out of Napoleon's funding of certain kinds of research. The listeners should definitely fact check me on a lot of this, but
Napoleon's responsible for my canned green beans. Is that what you're saying there?
I'm gonna have to fact check. As the conversation,
you know what? This is going to be a meme from this point forward, regardless of whether it's true or not.
Okay, I swear I read this, but I'm not confident enough to put that out without fact checking myself. So I'll do that momentarily. But I'll come up with some more lists. But one tiny little point I just want to make in response to the libertarian case is that libertarianism came out of government funding. So take that, libertarians, in the sense that Milton Friedman worked at the University of Chicago for like 30 years, and the University of Chicago is a publicly funded institution. And I'm imagining if I looked at a lot of the institutions that the other big libertarians worked at, if they're working at big universities, these are typically publicly funded in the United States.
So can I try to maybe explain my own intellectual framework on this and how I've kind of looked at this? So what we're really talking about is the concept of a market failure. I talked to two anarcho-capitalists in between episodes here. One was Logan, and another one I won't name, but we'll call him Milton. Both of them told me point blank that I didn't know anything about economics, because apparently knowing something about economics to them means Austrian economics, right?
So I've learned that. Yeah.
So, but when I study economics in school, there's this concept of a market failure. And a market failure is this idea that we've talked somewhat about in past episodes, that the market is blind to solving certain kinds of problems and that it just can't do it. Okay. And this is a fundamental part of how they teach you economics today. And this includes the concept of public goods, which we've talked about. It includes the concept of externalities. So the whole thing with selling bees, and then that Scott Alexander came up with, or just the more standard example is pollution, air pollution, that the market can't see I'm causing harm through air pollution. And in fact, actually, the market may benefit from air pollution because that raises the profits of the healthcare, sector. And we know this is actually a bad thing, but as far as the market's concerned, it's a good thing. So air pollution continues to rise and people die from cancer and things like this. Is kind of the standard example that they would use when they're teaching the concept. Okay. There's numerous other well-known market failures, which I didn't think to research this before this podcast, or I'd have it ready, where the market is just blind. And that's why there's this need to try to come up with this God's eye view, as Scott Alexander explains, to correct the problem. Because, in fact, everything in Scott Alexander's FAQ is really various kinds of market failures, where the market is just incapable of solving these problems efficiently, whereas government can solve them efficiently and does often solve them efficiently. Now, it seems like anytime you raise this to a libertarian, depending on what type of libertarian they are, you're either going to get in my opinion, really unrealistic argument that all those things actually would have been solved by markets. There are no market failures. They have complete faith that there's simply no such thing as a market failure. Market failures are fake. Okay. Or if they're maybe a better libertarian, they'll admit that market failures are real things. Logan did, by the way, just for the record. He'll admit that there are certain sorts of problems, but then he's going to say something like, but really, that's just a matter of we don't yet have the knowledge how to privatize air. And if we privatized air, then the market could solve those problems too. And that would be kind of the all-purpose answer. Even like Scott Alexander's example of pollution in a lake where the water moves around. He's intentionally picking the hardest examples. But I think a Logan-type libertarian, the kind of the good ones that aren't quite so crazy, I definitely hold Logan in the good category. They're going to say, well, but it's just a matter of you need to actually figure out how to privatize this. And there's no reason why you can't, that Zeit Deutsch at this point, if it isn't denied by the laws of physics, then you can do it. And all problems are soluble. And so it's just a matter of, maybe we can't solve that problem with the market today, but we can in the future, and therefore, and the markets are always the best. This is the other thing, is always the best at solving these problems and creating knowledge as quickly as possible. Therefore, we should look into trying to privatize things as quickly as we can. And that's actually kind of the second argument I often get, right?
Maybe a third type here, just to interject quickly, is just the type that recognizes that there are market failures, but then says it's not obvious that government can solve those better than the private market. Like the private market, it falls short in various ways for lots of these problems, but it's not clear that the government will actually do any better. So I have someone like Kaplan in mind here. So those kind of people, they're very much not blind to market failures, but they're just more skeptical that government is actually solving those problems efficiently, or they think it's harder for government to do so than many people would, than we would, for instance. So that's sort of a third type, where they're not appealing to this weird like Deutschian anything's possible with laws of physics stuff. It's more just like you're begging the question somewhat if you assume just because there's a market failure that government can step in and solve it better than the market.
So it seems to me that now we can refer to, if that's the argument, then we can refer to Scott Alexander's fact here, right? We can actually point out that the government has a long history of solving these sorts of problems very successfully in areas that we know markets don't solve them as of today, right? So I feel like at this point that theory is refuted. I mean, if that's the theory, that's the opposing theory that markets could do it. I don't think there's any. Markets cannot do it as of today. It requires specialized knowledge how to privatize things at a minimum, right? And we don't necessarily know how to privatize air, for example. And that's assuming that's even a desirable thing, which I doubt it is. But
so I agree with you with respect to some of the market failures we talked about in other episodes. But the stuff where you just list the stuff government has funded and like this sort of innovation that's come out of government, that doesn't fall into the market failures category for me, because we know that private industry does produce stuff. It's not like we're in this situation where private industry can't innovate. And then we say, and then a libertarian says, well, government couldn't innovate either. And then you say, well, here's a bunch of examples of government innovating, right? It's not that sort of situation. It's that they claim that the private market is better at innovating than government, in which case just listing stuff government has done falls short of sort of dealing with that argument.
I kind of want to just, for the listener, just give a bit of structural information about this section, and then just orient. So, the section is political issues, and it's basically 5 subsections, where first he talks about the general case of the government can never do anything right, and then he just gives some examples of the government doing things right. And then in the following 4 subsections, he goes into the specific cases of healthcare, prison privatization, gun control, and education. As for very major sectors of society where Scott's going to argue the specifics of why government and a public approach to these cases is better than a private approach. So just for the listener, it's not that the section consists solely of giving examples. That's kind of just the first piece.
Yeah. So,
whether or not we're going to go into all 4 of these is kind of up in the air, because I think this is I think we may be more high level, but just for the listener, if you ever encounter cases, conversations where people say that, say prison privatization is definitely a good thing, this is a good resource to consult for potentially reasons why it's not. Yeah. So
I think some market failures are rather concrete and others are a lot squishier. And I think that's kind of what Ben is getting at, right? So if we're talking about pollution, the market has no history of successfully solving pollution, and the government has a very strong history of successfully solving it. But if we're talking about research, scientific research, you can make similar arguments that there's a market failure, that you'll end up with private industry only doing certain in fact, are you familiar with Kenneth Stanley's book, Why Greatness Cannot Be Planned? He actually makes an argument to this effect, that certain types of the market only is interested in a certain kind of research, and we really need both kinds. And so it has to be publicly funded to be able to get the more basic research, as Ben was calling it. So, I mean, I don't know if that's true or not. Like, I literally could not tell you if that's an accurate understanding of market failures or not. That is a theory about a market failure. That's a particularly hard to test theory, right? And so if a libertarian were to say, well, how do you know? I'd say, I don't know. How do you know it's not the other way around? And they always feel like they know, right? They're always sure the market would have done better. And my position isn't that I'm sure the market is, the government's doing a better job with basic research than the market. Like, I don't know, right? And so the big difference between our arguments is they know or claim to know, and I claim to not know. Now, I'll go on a limb. If we're talking pollution, I do claim to know. I claim to know that pollution is something that the market has consistently failed to solve and that government has consistently outperformed the market on. The argument, well, if we could privatize air, that would take care of it. Well, I don't know. I mean, like, that's a theory, right? That could be true. That could also be really bad idea. Like,
yeah, I think you should run screaming from anyone who advocates the position that they privatize air. Like, just run away from that person as fast as friggin' possible.
But I know for sure that today pollution is not solvable by the market. And any libertarian who tells me otherwise, they are mistaken, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's actually that simple. So it seems like what we're really doing is we're pushing the argument to, okay, how would the market solve this if we had the right kind of knowledge, right?
Yeah.
So from an incrementalist standpoint, I see nothing wrong with trying social medicine. From an incrementalist standpoint, I see nothing wrong with trying true privatized medicine, right? Not the half-breed, that we're currently doing in America. The thing that I'm struggling with is, okay, so let's use healthcare as the example. Okay, so healthcare, he gives everything comes down to market failures. Can the market solve this problem on its own or efficiently, or do you need a government to step in? Okay, this is the question we're always asking. And we can ask the question two ways. We can ask as of today, at our current level of knowledge, or we can ask it as a hypothetical, what if we had different knowledge in the future? Would it be worth changing our mind? In some sense, I'm not so interested in the future question because that's utopianism, right? Let's wait for the knowledge to come, and then at that point, we'll have new options available to us, and we'll solve our problems differently at that point. So for me, a lot of times the question just boils down to, as of today, there is no way to do anarcho-capitalism, so it is a false theory. There could be a true anarcho-capitalism in the future for a different knowledge state. I don't know. That's a prophecy, and I'm not so worried about that. I'm neither denying it or avoiding it. But I always consider it a question of, is this a true market failure or are we imagining it? Would the market actually solve this better than we think? And then I do consider that to always, always be a question that we must test. Okay, it actually go out and try. Okay, and there's the whole problem with, like, he gives some really good numbers on how successful social medicine has been compared to, quote, privatized medicine, where America is being held up as the example of privatized medicine. Well, the American system sucks. Like, I don't know if you would realistically even call it privatized medicine. It's almost more like we took all the bad stuff in social medicine, included all of that, and then took all the bad stuff from privatized medicine and included all of that and made sure that we had the worst possible system imaginable, right? So it maybe isn't too surprising that the social medicine numbers look really good compared to the, quote, privatized numbers.
That's the thing, right? Like, no libertarian, it's back to that thing, like, no libertarian is holding the American system up as some ideal. And right. So it's like, I'm not sure exactly who he's arguing against here.
So I feel like these are empirical questions. I need to probably be careful with the word empirical. So let me track that a little
fine.
bit.
Yeah.
These are testable questions. These are testable questions.
Our audience isn't as picky as that. I know what you mean, but yeah, you don't need to be worried about that. So
this is a little bit of a tangent, but actually that was one of the main things that you and Sam and me were arguing over on Twitter, right? Can you test political theories? And the argument that he was making was that Popper had a specific idea of testability in science, of what counted as empirical, and politics and economics doesn't fall within that bucket because it's not an experiment with an up or down result. Okay, and he's right about that. But then he kind of picked the side, so therefore I'm on the other side of the demarcation line, which means it's purely metaphysical, it's just a moral theory, is what he said. And therefore we can't actually test it, we just criticize it using other theories and using criticism and things like that. And that kind of misses the point that we drastically test are political and economic theories. They may not be a straight laboratory test. What we actually do is we go implement them and then see what happens.
Exactly.
And this notion of testability or empirical outcomes or something like that, I will admit that politics and economics is squishier compared to physics. But the idea that we should entirely do away with the concept of testability and not let real life tests be the determiner of what we're actually going to, which theories survive the best, I consider that a completely false view. In fact, I refer to that as the crit rat backdoor. Like, let's throw as much as we can that we're interested in. We're going to declare it metaphysical, and then we're free from the harshness of critical rationalism, where you have to actually test everything. You have to follow Popper's ratchet and solve all your problems by making your theories more empirical. That's hard, right? Like, that's a harsh mistress. I'm not going to do that. So all my pet theories, I'm declaring them all to be metaphysical, and now I don't have to worry. We're just going to use criticism, you know? And I call that the crit rat backdoor, right? That we want to push 100%. As many theories as we can to make them as untestable as we can. That way we don't have to actually see our theories actually get refuted.
Yeah.
Okay. So you've just drawn my attention. Something has bugged me about that for a long time, besides the obvious stuff. But I think I have I understand the explicit sleight of hand that's going on. And it ignores the fact that even in like a moral theory, if you just agree on the outcomes that you want to see, okay? So like I agree that you can't just run a test to determine what outcomes you want to see. That's like up to us to decide, like what sort of outcomes would we like to see in the world, and then we argue about that. But once we've decided on the fact that we want people to be happier and healthier and more wealthy, all things equal. Once we've decided on outcomes like that, then we can run tests on various policies to see which ones achieve those sorts of ends. That's very different from like running tests to decide to achieve the ends themselves. So there's different ways about testing theories here. But once you've agreed on the goal you want to achieve, just because that discussion itself is metaphysical doesn't mean then you can run upstream tests on various policies to determine like which ones actually achieve those sorts of outcomes.
Yes, and what types of unintended consequences there were. Sometimes Keynesian economics works almost exactly the way Keynes says it does. The real problem with it is that it has these giant unintended consequences that he never thought of, right? So, okay, sorry, Vaden, go ahead.
No, I just feel a bit of an obligation to just say to the audience who hasn't been following the nitty-gritty of what we mean by metaphysical here, just what we're talking about, because I know we're going to lose some people. And
I
just think it's useful to maybe just quickly summarize what we're saying with regards to this metaphysical stuff, because that can be one of these words that kind of sounds jargony to maybe an audience who hasn't been in the weeds with Popper as much as we have. So quick. Oh, sorry.
And Popper uses the term almost entirely differently from everybody else in the world, which just makes it even more confusing. So
that's also a good point. Yeah. So just for the audience who doesn't know what we're talking about, so Popper is quite famous for his falsification stuff, but he quickly realized that there's a whole class of theories that aren't falsifiable, including his own philosophy and philosophy in general. And so he was then very concerned with being misunderstood as saying that any theory which isn't falsifiable is worthless. It's a waste of time. It's useless. And that's not what he's saying. So when Bruce mentions the demarcation criterion, what he's saying is that Popper buckets two classes of theories. There's, quote, the scientific theories, which are amenable to tests and falsification through empirical methods. So you can test whether or not the fertilizer is going to grow your plants higher than not using fertilizer, say. And then there's metaphysical theories, which are those theories which aren't falsifiable, such as things like determinism or Popperian epistemology or Kant's metaethics, say. And these he calls metaphysical theories. Okay, so that's all fine, well and good. But then the kind of the crit rat sleight of hand, which has been deployed a lot by libertarian folks, which I wrote a long screed about. That's my most recent blog post. Is that what some critical rationalists are doing? Is they're saying, well, libertarianism and my favorite philosophy is a metaphysical theory. They're just declaring it to be metaphysical because people like me come around and say, well, If you're so excited about Austrian economics, like, what do you expect to see in Javier Milei's government in Argentina? And they say, well, I can't make predictions. You're asking me to make a prediction?
It's a metaphysical theory.
It's a metaphysical theory. You can't
test this, right?
And so they're kind of using this metaphysical thing as like a shield or as a backdoor to just hide all of their preferred theories behind this wall of Popperian terminology. And ironically, they're doing it in such a way that they're kind of protecting it from form of criticism. This gets to maybe an interesting discussion, which I'm curious, Bruce, because you said that they're right about this, which is this distinction between economic theories and political theories. I think that distinction is kind of bullshit, but I'm curious why, or maybe I'm wrong, but maybe you should set that up a bit for the audience.
Yeah. So Logan offered to talk. He had heard I was on these podcasts. Yeah. I don't think he's listened to them. At least he didn't indicate that he had. But he heard I was on these podcasts and saw me, you, me, and Sam arguing about libertarianism. And so he offered to have a discussion with me. What he did is first of all, he laid out for me 3 kinds of anarcho-capitalists. And let me actually take you through the 3 kinds. Okay. And so you have the non-aggression principle libertarians or anarcho-capitalists. We're going to use libertarian and anarcho-capitalist as synonyms just for our purposes. But just keep in mind, libertarianism is a much broader term that includes maybe people like me, maybe just someone who wants to shrink government. I mean, it's a much broader term than anarcho-capitalist, but sometimes they're used as synonyms. So we might have the non-aggression principle libertarians. So he says these are like deontological libertarians. They start with a moral principle like the non-aggression principle, and then they try to maximize it. So he claims that they would argue that theirs is not a political theory, but a moral theory, because even being a political theory assumes a violation of the non-aggression principle, which in their mind would be that there's no government at all, therefore no politics per se. But they may drop to moral arguments and just make consequentialist arguments using economics. Then he says the second group is what he calls conspiratarians. So if you'll recall, I mentioned that it's really common for libertarians to be conspiracy theorists. So he's noticed that, right? And he says these are the conspiracy-minded libertarians. They think the government is not a mere mistake, but it is that it's an evil because it was a conspiracy to oppress people. They tend to be, he also calls them the Zionist occupied governments because they're often very anti-Semitic and they have this big theory about the Jews took over or something like that.
Yeah. And he says, really? I haven't noticed that. That's fascinating.
So he says culture for them is downstream of politics. They would even say like COVID was a conspiracy, right? And then you have the revolutionary libertarians. These are kind of the Rothbardians. So to Rothbard's question, do you hate the state? You have to answer yes to be in this category. So like Rothbard said that David Friedman, who obviously would be considered an anarcho-capitalist, that he just didn't hate the state. So he didn't, Rothbard would rather deal with someone who is a revolutionary minimalist that still believed in government than someone like David Friedman that kind of wants to be reasonable about these things, which is why I love David Friedman anyhow. So Logan said, I don't know if this is an exact quote, but he tried to give me as close a paraphrase as he could. He says, Rothbard asked, if you could hit a button to make the government disappear, would you hit it so fast that your finger would blister?
Nice. Yeah.
So Logan believes that this group is a utopian view and that, he thinks it's kind of scary and dangerous. So now I said something negative about all 3 of the forms of libertarianism. So this leads to an obvious question. Which one is Logan? Logan is none. He does not see himself as belonging to any of the categories. He instead says, I don't really care about the politics. I just want to teach good economic principles. And then I'd say, okay, so I'm saying, Logan, that it's a prophecy to claim that we know that one day we're going to get rid of government, public government, and that our best way to solve all our problems will most efficiently will turn out to be using privatized governments. And he goes, oh, that's not true. I'm like, wait. You said you're just teaching good economic principles. So we kind of talked about that. And I don't know, it's like he clearly kind of is an anarcho-capitalist still, but I don't think he like labels himself as such because he realizes that that's this political view that he can't quite agree with any of its current forms, right?
Do you know how he would answer the question, Logan, do you think taxation is theft?
Yeah, I mean, in the past he said it is, but I would be surprised if he still said that.
Okay, cool. Yeah.
Based on how he's currently talking. Sam wouldn't say that. He was willing to say it was extortion, but that was about as far as he was willing to go. So
okay. Interesting. Yeah.
I don't know. That's a good question.
Yeah.
Okay, so
that's a useful taxonomy though, for sure. Yeah.
So Logan explains it like this, and here's the quote first for me to read on the air. So this is literally Logan's words. Okay. He says, the conditions under which profit loss can and cannot be calculated are universal for any conceivable good or service, from milk to comedy shows to military defense. So before I go on and kind of explain more of his view, maybe we can talk about that quote briefly. What do you guys think of that?
I think I need more context, first of all, why the profit loss calculation is relevant in the larger scheme of things. But Ben, maybe you have more insightful.
Well, so this is just the economic calculation problem, right? And he's saying it's impossible for a government which is not in possession of all the information to actually make the appropriate calculation as to what the prices should be for any various good. And so that's what I take him to mean. And and then I guess his claim is just that statement holds universally for all goods. There is no single good for which a government, say, or any sort of organization could actually dictate the price such that the price would be efficient or something.
Hold on. No, computing the optimal price, I agree, is not possible. But that's different than computing profits and losses, though, right? Because presumably the government can keep a balance sheet of how much certain sectors are bringing in and how much they're expending, how much they're taking in from taxes, and then how much they're spending on military, say, and then compute profits and losses that way. So are we talking about the same thing here?
Yeah, I was assuming he was talking about prices, but I'm not sure. Bruce, maybe clarify. I guess he did say profits and losses, but then it's unclear what his statement
presumably
is.
a shop can compute their profits and losses, and so too can a government. I don't know why the government is somehow unable to do what a tiny shopkeeper can do. Right?
The reason why I made you guys answer that question before I said anything is because this statement is a little bit hard to parse.
Can you read it one more time, actually?
The conditions under which profit loss can and cannot be calculated are universal for any conceivable good or service, from milk to comedy shows to military defense. I think he means exactly what Ben is saying. I think there's an assumption of efficiency here, too. He didn't actually use the word efficient anywhere in here. But yes, of course, the government could probably calculate its profit and loss, but it cannot efficiently figure out how to price things so that they actually represent the actual value that the consumer is going to get out of it. So if the government produces, bread, then it's going to have a profit and loss, but it will not be the efficient profit and loss that, makes sense that had you use a market to do it. That's my take on what he's trying to say here. And I was pushing him for a universal law. So he was trying to explain what he understood economics is universal laws, is one of his claims, right? Or a universal law. I mean, what is the universal law? I don't even know what you mean by that economics has certain universal laws. And this is what he came up with.
Off the top of my head, I don't know if these would count, but yeah, I could see a centralized agency cannot efficiently set the price of a good or service without causing some sort of economic harm. Distortion. Or supply and demand would be a universal law, that if you keep the supply of something fixed and you increase the demand of that thing, then the price is going to rise, say.
Right.
So these would be examples of universal laws within economics. But whether or not these are libertarian laws or this is, meta comment, but anytime a libertarian or any economic thinker comes up with a true universal law, that is no longer going to be associated with libertarianism anymore. It's just going to be associated with our mainstream body of knowledge of economic thought. Right. And so as like there's all sorts of brilliant ideas that's
what Milton and I discussed, actually. That was our main discussion.
Like the labor theory of value is completely bunk, and that's because of the Austrian critique of it. But now we don't ever think of it as an Austrian critique anymore, just like we don't think of things like child labor laws being a Marxist idea, even though it originated from Marx. It just gets integrated in. And so what this leads to, though, is when all of the good ideas are just now part of mainstream economics, you're left with a residual class of the hardcore adherents to all the nutty ideas that then define themselves outside of mainstream econ.
This was exactly my discussion with Milton. Interesting. Okay. When Logan gave me, so you know how discussions are. We're talking on the phone, we're texting each other, and threads get dropped, right? So my response to Logan when he gave me this was, this is just shy of a tautology, right? That it's not a tautology. I will admit there's some content here. But what you're basically saying is that, I mean, markets are how we come up with the correct price for something and how we efficiently calculate profits and losses. If we're trying to accomplish something else, like let's say we're dealing with pollution, right? Mm-hmm. We don't even call it profit or loss or pricing. I know that what he wants to next say is, well, but we could, right? But like, it's not obvious that that's the right way to go about it. Mm-hmm. And so the problem with this statement in my mind is that, like, it's true when it's true. But now we have to actually decide under which circumstances does it make sense to try to turn this particular problem into a profit-loss problem, right? And try to have the market price it. And that's what market failures are all about. Again, if we're assuming that we're living in some future utopia where we've solved all problems with market failures, assuming that's even possible, which it may not be possible, right? We don't even know that. Right? Then sure, I can see how at that point, this statement becomes this sort of universal law over almost everything with human interactions. You're going to be solving pollution through profit and loss. You're going to be solving problems with the water or bees or healthcare. Everything's going to be solved through profit and loss at that point. But isn't that then a circular argument? Because you're already assuming you've already solved all the market failures that actually exist in real life. And you're even assuming you can solve them all. And there's not something that stops you, or that it's just undesirable to in some cases. Going back to the privatizing air, is it, even if you could privatize air, even if you had, that I don't deny that technology will one day exist where we could privatize air. If you could, would that be what we as a society would want to do? I don't think that's, I don't know. I mean, you said run from anybody. I'm not even going to say run from them. Like, maybe we would want to. That's so far out. I don't think there's anything but a prophecy here. If you're trying to say, yes, we could, or no, we couldn't, you just don't know what our problem state's going to look like by that point.
And it's the solution to the wrong problem, I think.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, it's an unclear solution to the wrong problem. So the reason I say that, so the right problem would be something like, the United States has, actually, I don't have to make up numbers here. I can use Scott Alexander's numbers. A infant mortality rate of 6.81, whereas Sweden has an infant mortality rate of 2.56 per 1,000 births. So how do we reduce the American infant mortality rate down to a level like Sweden? So that would be a problem that I think is very worth solving, and perhaps the answer is free market stuff, or maybe it's government, who knows. But it sounds like the problem that Milton and a lot of libertarians are trying to solve is not something like concrete that's actually a problem independent of your philosophy. It's just a problem that everyone agrees is a problem. But their problem is, how do we get rid of government from some area? So they're starting with that as the problem. We want to just, government does this and we want to get rid of it. And so how do we solve that problem? But that is a problem from within the framework of belief that if you get rid of government, then things like the infant mortality rate will increase. So it's an intermediate step that they're hoping will solve all of these concrete specific things. Whereas I would rather focus on each concrete specific thing and then not hamstring ourselves to the idea of getting rid of the government as the solution to that thing. So I think the prophecy component is a consequence of starting with the wrong kinds of problems. It leads to prophecy. Yeah.
Or to put this like a slightly different way, it's just that if your claim is you want the most efficient prices, then sure, I agree that this is something close to universal law. But there's no saying that in each situation, we actually want the most efficient prices above all else, right? There's considerations of well-being, et cetera, that we might want to take into account. And often having a system with efficient prices leads to the most well-being for everyone, but sometimes it doesn't. And those are precisely situations in which we have market failures, in which case you want your primary target to be something like, how do we increase well-being as much as possible, as opposed to how do we get the most efficient prices? So it's just, it kind of begs the question in terms of what we want to see.
Unfortunately, after I made this criticism, the thread went a different direction, and I never actually got a response back from Logan on this. So now here is my take, and this is my interpretation of Logan, just to be clear. But I think that his view is as follows. There exists a best theory of economics. This is the theory of Austrian economics. This theory is a branch of physics, and he did say that. So I feel comfortable saying that.
Yeah.
Like physics, this economic theory is made up of universal principles. Like physics, the theory is value-free. It is not in and of itself a political or moral theory. There is no known equally good competing theory. Just like physics, we embrace this theory as correct until there's a competitor. This is why they often try to ask you for what your competing theory is when you try to challenge them on this. So then there also exists a set of political theories that we might loosely call anarcho-capitalism, possibly libertarianism. I think anarcho-capitalism is the better one to call it here. So Logan considers all these theories to be incorrect in some way and prefers to see himself, instead of talking about the good economic theories, the Austrian economics is what he means by that. However, I also gather that Logan does believe it is desirable to eventually get rid of public government. And in this sense, he is endorsing what I would still see as a form of anarcho-capitalism, although he never comes out and definitively says it, if that makes any sense. But I'm interpreting him that I'm pretty sure he does mean that at some level. Okay. Now, to some degree, this makes a little sense to me, though. I mean, if the term anarcho-capitalist refers to those three branches that he's referred to, and all of them are kind of nutters, which I agree with him, they all are, then I can see, for the same reason that I don't call myself a libertarian, even though arguably I am, because that term has come to mean certain connotations that I don't want to be associated with. So I call myself a conservative instead. And even that's a struggle now, because that is now a term that's starting to come to have connotations that I don't want to be associated with. So I can understand how Logan may want to push away from the anarcho-capitalist label while also at some level embracing it. That doesn't even strike me as unreasonable.
I'm like that with critical rationalism now, so I get that.
Yeah. Okay, so that I think is, so the main takeaway here, though, is that we're talking about a pure economic theory, which is Austrian economics, and then a political theory, and that the two aren't the same thing in his mind. This is something Milton emphasized to me too. Okay, I would actually like to, before I say my own feelings, I would actually like to hear what you guys think of that.
I don't mind it too much, actually, but anytime you actually want to like instantiate the economic theory to do things in the world, to get things done, then you're automatically dealing with political questions. So it's fine to talk about like pie in the sky econ theory about, the possibility of setting the most efficient prices for some like narrow conception of profits and losses, etc. That's fine. But as soon as you want to invoke those sort of theories in government as policy, or I guess not in government, I guess to abolish government, then you're dealing with political questions. So as soon as these kind of theories make touch with reality, then you're dealing with politics, and you're dealing with, are there things to consider besides prices, or does the efficiency of prices correlate with well-being in the situation, et cetera. And so as soon as it makes contact with reality, then I think it all becomes one thing and you can't escape the political aspects of the theory. So I don't mind them drawing the distinction, but I think as soon as you're actually operating in the real world and you start thinking about governments and regulation and free markets, et cetera, and all the actual thorny questions that you have to deal with day to day, then there ceases to be much of a difference because political questions will sort of always be at the forefront.
Vaden, before I let you give an answer, I said something similar to that to Logan, and he gave me a response. So I actually want to read what it is that he said to that. Okay.
Great. Yeah.
So first of all, he didn't really disagree with that thought that Ben just expressed. Okay. That's exactly right. It's difficult to tease apart exactly political questions. Economics is going to have to be implemented. That's going to then be political. He didn't really deny any of that. So he's admitting to the fuzziness to some degree. But then he tried to explain it like this. He said, so you have the value-free economics that do not tell you how to organize society, just like physics doesn't tell you how to organize society. And keep in mind that in his mind, economics is a branch of physics. Okay. But we are free to conjecture what we think is the best organization for society as either moral or political theories. Or if you prefer, we could call them anti-political theories. An anarcho-capitalist, maybe that's not a political theory so much as an anti-political theory, since they want to do away with governments. Okay, but either way, we can call those political theories. And then we can then use the correct economic principles as criticisms of the moral and political theories. So this value-free version of economics is why Logan makes claims like you could believe in Austrian economics and be a communist. So he did say that to me at one point. And this is what he's really trying to get at, is that there is this value-free economics that don't tell you how to organize society, and then yes, you then use those to criticize your political theories of what you're actually going to do. Thoughts on that?
Yeah. Okay. So you cannot simultaneously claim that your theory is equivalent to physics and that your theory is metaphysics. Because physics is empirical and metaphysics isn't. So first point. Second point is that both of these claims are just ways to get out of having any responsibility to suggest policy proposals or be empirically falsifiable. So I disagree with so much of not Logan's position, but your take on Logan's position, I recognize. First, physics isn't value-free. I don't know what the hell he's talking about. Physics is completely value-laden. It values truth. It values parsimony. It values realism. It is not value-free. You can't do science value-free because one of the things that we value in science is truth and reality and wanting to understand it and explanations. These are all values. There is no clean distinction between values and science in this fashion. Physicists don't suggest ways to live. What are you talking about? So when you make the Manhattan Project, or when you participate in the Manhattan Project and you make the nuclear bomb, these scientists wrote letters to Congress talking about nuclear policy and things. If you invent electricity, it immediately suggests certain things about how we should be living in a society. We should live in a society with more light in it. The minds of the person that invents something don't bifurcate in this way of being completely neutral and having nothing to say about policy when they're doing science. They're continuously doing science because they're thinking about social problems and they're thinking about values of truth and beauty and yada, yada, yada. But there's no clean, neat bifurcation. This is utter fiction. It's a fiction that is useful for the libertarians because they want to get out of having to be concrete with any policy proposal. So tying their theory to physics in this way is just a way, just a rank appeal to authority. Also, physics isn't the only branch of science that deals in universal principles. So does biology with principles of evolution. So does arguably any science worth its salt, even social science. It's harder to do, but they're trying to come up with universal principles. This is the open society could be described as a universal principle about how best to create flourishing human beings, right? Any human being living in any society anywhere will have a better time if they're not living under an authoritarian dictator. This is a universal principle. So I don't agree with like any single sentence in that summary, because I think that it's entirely just a fiction about how science is practiced, how science actually works. And it's just used as a means of saying, for example, we should completely get rid of government and publicly funded research. Okay, so are you in favor of Javier Milei completely gutting Argentinian research facilities? Well, that's just politics. I have nothing to say about politics. If your economic theory has no political implications, then it is completely useless. You may as well be writing Harry Potter. But obviously it has political implications. That's why you want the frickin' thing to be implemented. So I don't buy this case at all. And in fact, I think it's just complete hogwash that indicates that they don't want to be held responsible for anything that they're saying.
Vaden, I feel like you're kind of not telling me what you really think. Can you maybe stop holding back and maybe like tell me what you really think? I mean, come on.
Yeah. But it was this line of thinking in conversations with Milton and Ludwig, which caused me to write a 10,000 word screed about how annoyed I am with this kind of argument. Because it's like you're going to just broadcast all these very strong opinions about how you think society should be run and what you think should and shouldn't happen with regards to private healthcare, private prisons, et cetera, et cetera. And then when someone like me says, well, are you sure that this is actually the right thing to do? They're like, no, my theory isn't political. My theory is metaphysical. My theory doesn't make any claims about how society should actually be run. That's politics, man. I don't deal in politics. I just deal in pure theory. It's like, get fucked. You're not talking about, you're just switching your argument as soon as you're pressed. And so I hate that kind of argumentation. It's just shady. It's a shady argument. So that's why I don't like it. Yeah.
Just, one final thing on Logan's stuff. I think, Vaden is reading into Logan's argument the consequences of reasoning like that. And, I think that's where a lot of your blistering criticism came from. I take your point about nothing is value free at the end of the day, but I think it's pretty legitimate to start drawing distinctions between purely economic theories in the sense of just reasoning about what sort of mechanisms will lead to optimal prices, where optimal is determined by some mathematical formula or some definition or something that we want to follow. And then just talking about, okay, do we actually want to implement this, et cetera? I would make the same case with physics with respect to light, which I think is a bit of a misleading example. We invent light, that doesn't tell you that you should just have lights on all the time everywhere, right? Now we have this thing, we have ways of lighting rooms after dark, but we have to decide what to do with that. And so I just wanted to make the much weaker claim that, I think there's a useful distinction to be made between purely mathematical economic theories that deal with things like prices and aggregates and tell you in theory how to organize auctions, say, such that you get optimal behavior of rational agents, where all these things are, have rigorous definitions behind them, and then discussions about how to instantiate that sort of stuff in real political systems when there are other considerations at play, and where something like the efficiency of prices might actually decouple from something like well-being because of stuff like externalities, et cetera. So I agree, this sort of decoupling between the political and the economic, as Logan wants to say it, can be used to hand wave a lot of arguments, and that can be frustrating, et cetera. But I think there is actually a legitimate distinction to be made between this kind of stuff he's talking about.
There's hard and there's soft distinctions, right? So are there distinctions to be made between, say, physics and chemistry? Well, yeah, depending on the context and depending on what you're talking about. So in one kind of conversation, you could say that physics is kind of continuous with chemistry. Other conversations, you could say, no, we kind of segment different branches. Yeah. It's emergent, etc. So that would be a soft distinction, because you make the distinction kind of relative to where you are in the conversation and what you're talking about. A hard distinction would be something like the difference between a proton and an electron. Say that there's no ambiguity between those two types of entities. And I think that the libertarian folks are trying to enforce a hard distinction when really it's just soft distinctions all the way through. There's not a clean line between the values and the science. Sometimes you want to make that distinction because, it's useful to just focus on how do you conduct electrons through a copper wire most efficiently, and then we'll think about how you best run a society later. Other times you think about this at the same time, depending on what you're considering. So that would kind of be just distinctions are not a Boolean operation. They're hard and soft and different kinds of distinctions.
Yeah, but after you know how to make the atomic bomb, you have a discussion about like how best to use it, right? That's a pretty hard and fast distinction in my head. It doesn't say the invention of the bomb itself doesn't tell you precisely how and when.
But the bomb was invented because of the value of liberal society and the values of destroying fascism, right?
Yeah. But there are correct ways to make bombs and incorrect ways, just like there are correct and incorrect economic theories.
But the action of going to make the bomb is not completely distinct and separate from the values. And that's the only thing I'm trying to emphasize, is that there's not a clean value, science, fact, value distinction that people want to make.
So Ben is making one point, which is that Logan is, at least in some sense, right, that we could theoretically tease apart economic principles from political policy. And in fact, I have to admit, I even agree with the idea that once you're thinking of it in that way, you could say, well, we're going to come up with political policy and we're going to use economic principles to criticize them. And that's the actual relationship between them. Okay. So I'm agreeing with Ben in that much. Despite that fact, I feel like I'm more in the Vaden camp. But let me explain why. Okay. Because I actually completely agree with Ben, like 100%.
God, I got to defend the Ludwigs and the Miltons of the world.
So here's the problem as I see it. So Milton would argue to me that, you don't know any economics, you need to learn economics, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, no, I took a graduate class in it. Well, that didn't impress him at all, because a graduate class is just this conglomeration of schools of thought, and they're not really related, and you don't really know what you're talking about because of that. It's all instrumentalist anyhow, et cetera, right?
Yeah.
And so what you learn doesn't matter. And so I would give them specific examples. I would say, what about supply and demand? Oh, that's in Austrian economics, so that one's okay. Oh, well, so that's realist, right? Yeah, well, I guess what I really mean is the stuff I disagree with, that's the instrumentalist stuff, right?
Yes, exactly.
And so as I was trying to go through it with him, he would mention animal spirits, right? That's not real. Now, animal spirits is a term that came from that era. It really doesn't have a clear-cut meaning, but it's the type of thing someone in philosophy would say back then. And it seems to mean really just people have wills and they make decisions and they do stuff.
And
right?
Notably, it's not taught in graduate school, is it?
It is not.
It's not as if the grad school is teaching.
It is nowhere in my book. Okay, so I brought that up. So I brought that up to him. Okay, that look, the only thing we're covering in Keynes is whether his theory worked or not. It did, but it had unintended consequences. There's 2 pages in the entire textbook about Keynes. It's just a historical note, and they're just trying to see what we can learn from it. Nothing in the textbook about money velocity, nothing about animal spirits. And then what his response was, no, you don't. You have to take the whole theory as a whole, right? So you can't just take a part of it. You have to take the whole theory as a whole. Okay, but that kind of makes sense if you're trying to equate economics to physics, because you can't just take part of general relativity, right? But economics isn't like that, okay? And to use a true analogy here, this is from Beginning of Infinity, page 255, where Deutsch talks about the difference between how philosophy is handled in schools versus science. Where philosophy, they try to read original texts and they try to understand what Aristotle was saying, where in science, they just do not care about the original text. They just want to know what the current best theory is. Economics is being treated like science. They're just simply taking the best of every single school. What actually in the real world actually works? What have we actually tested? What actually makes a difference? And we're collecting it all. These are the best principles that we know about. Okay. And I liked how you put that, Vaden, where you said, look, they took some stuff from Marx. They took some stuff from Austrian economics, et cetera. Okay.
And some stuff from Keynes.
And some stuff from Keynes, right? Keynes had some interesting things to say that turned out to be true. Okay. And in fact, my graduate school text in economics is the best theory of economics, best theories of economics. And this obsession with schools makes 0 sense. Okay. Once you understand that that's what it is, that they're obsessing over a specific school. And I think it's even for the reason that Vaden explained, that they've got these kind of pet theories that can only be derived from their theory. And so they're trying to concentrate on the stuff that it hasn't become mainstream economics at this point. I think what this really means in principle is that Austrian School of Economics is not only not a best theory of economics, not by a long shot, but it's not even a theory of economics, right? It is absolutely a weird mix of political theories, totally politically motivated. Like, is there any doubt Rothbard was deeply politically motivated and how he came up with his economics, right?
Yeah.
And so like to make this distinction, yes, in principle, economics can be taken separate from politics, but you better be talking about my graduate textbook, not the Austrian School of Economics when you say that. Because if you're talking about the Austrian School of Economics, that is a political theory. Like, first and foremost, it is a political theory that also happened to sometimes have some good economics in it that we've since integrated into best economics theories, right? My economic textbook comes way closer to what you guys are talking about. Just a bunch of principles, a bunch of theories, kind of value-free. They don't really tell you specifically what you should try to do. Some of them are even a little contradictory. Should you use Keynes? It makes sense. It follows naturally from the law of supply and demand. Oh, but there's these unintended consequences. What are those? We're still trying to figure those out, you know? I mean, like, really, that is what I have in mind when I'm thinking of best economic theories that are separable, at least to some degree, from politics. I don't think Austrian School of Economics even comes close to qualifying as something that's separable from politics. So, and then I have to make it, I'm sorry, I have to make a comment about the whole physics thing.
Yeah.
So I'm a little unclear what the it's a branch of physics thing really means. And I did push Logan on that a little bit, but I still don't feel like I understand it. Normally, I would think of declaring something to be a branch of physics as it's derivable from physics, which is clearly you cannot derive economics from physics. So clearly they don't mean that, right? And it's almost like it's a misunderstanding of when Deutsch claimed that computational theory is a branch of physics, right? Like, that's the only time I've ever heard those terms. That makes sense in the case of computational theory, because computational theory was actually about what can you actually physically compute. That's a giant, like, most people think of computational theory as mathematics. Deutsch was the first to point out, yes, it's mathematics, but it's what you can actually compute mathematically in real life using the laws of physics. Okay, so there's this obvious direct tie to physics. There seems to be no tie at all with the economics. In fact, if anything, I feel like they're inverting it, where they're saying it's impossible to calculate prices, you know, true profit loss prices or whatever, except using free markets. That's the principle that I think they're really getting at. And because it's impossible to do otherwise, or so they're claiming, then because everything that's possible, what's the Deutsch saying? That anything that isn't denied by the laws of physics is possible. So if you can't do this, if it's impossible to calculate this, then that must be that the laws of physics are denying you the ability to calculate this. And therefore, this is now a branch of physics. I think that's the underlying thought that they're getting to. I just want to point out that that's false, okay? First of all, it's trivial to calculate without markets if you're, 20 people living in a tribe. I mean, like, they did that for literally hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years. There was no free markets and they didn't need them. And they would have often very egalitarian societies that would make, communists blush, because it's super easy to calculate this if you've only got 20 people and that's all who you need to keep track of. So right off the bat, there's this extra caveat. Well, we're actually talking about large scale societies, but they're not doing it implicitly. And then who knows what the future holds? Like, what if there's some future, race that is intelligent, that is a hive mind, and it becomes trivial to calculate, profits and losses without using a free market because they're all a hive mind. Of course, this is a ridiculous example, but I'm trying to make the point that they're talking about a parochial thing to begin with. Basically, what they're really saying is, based on our current level of knowledge, you must use free markets to calculate profit and loss and to make it efficiently and accurately. Well, that's a true statement. But now we've thrown enough caveats on there. It has to be a large-scale society. We're not talking about hive minds. We're talking about human beings. And it's no longer clear what the connection to physics is. I think there's zero connection to physics, personally, right? So
yeah, I think it's just physics envy and a appeal to authority. That's how I interpret it. There's no strong connection, and it's physics is just held as like the gold standard of science, rightly or wrongly. That is kind of how it's held.
It's reductionist, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's we can reduce economics to physics. Well, no, you can't. Well, we mean in principle we could. You know, I mean,
yeah, like the same people who say it's physics will also say it's metaphysics, and also be against reductionism, and also say that economics is emergent. So, what are you talking about, people? Yeah. When you make all, and I know that they've all come from the same. These arguments have all come from the same person, Milton, and so it's just incoherent.
Also, just a note on the animal spirits thing, like there's something so ironic about using that to try and throw out all of Keynes's ideas. For one, it's not like he was appealing to this in like his equations or like showing up justifying his policies to government by appealing to animal spirits. Second, and most ironic, is that he was using it in a way that libertarians and anarcho-capitalists use it. They often say like the action principle or human action. He was using it in a very similar way. So what he meant was that like in periods of like volatility, and because the future is uncertain, humans rarely act by some like under some perfect rubric of rationality. We don't have like a set number of options in front of us, have probabilities for each of them, start multiplying them out, and then do what that calculus tells us. He was saying often it appears from on high, like people are just acting according to their animal spirits, meaning people take what you might perceive as sort of rash decisions that couldn't be predicted in advance, and that you might not understand the full reasoning for doing it. And so it's difficult for government to boil this down to like a perfect economic calculation problem. So he was using it in a way that they just call this like the action principle or whatever it's called, right? The action axiom, where they say humans, they take actions in the world and you can't boil their decisions down to some perfect mathematical process. He was using it in the exact same fucking way. So it's just bizarrely ironic for them to like latch onto this one piece of I think he said this once in his treatise. He was like, it's basically like animal spirits, and it's just crazy for them to latch onto this and throw out all of his ideas because of it.
Yeah, that's great. So I haven't read the source quote, but if I understood what you're saying correctly, it's not that he was literally saying animal spirits exist. He was using like a metaphor for irrationality or unpredictable behavior.
It was a term commonly used in philosophy at the time. He was using a common, vague but well-known term at the time, right? It doesn't really mean anything much to us anymore. It's fallen out of use.
But so this was quite scattershot and staying at the high level, but I think we should try to at least summarize what we talked about in this conversation, just because there was a lot of different things. And Bruce, you have some more.
Since we're already so scattershot, can I just do one more scattershot across the bow?
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
Of course. Yeah.
Scott Alexander himself calls himself a libertarian. So he is a libertarian. Okay. Kind of, sort of. And in fact, he actually posts he calls it a something sort of like left libertarianismist manifesto as one on his website. And then on a different one on his debates, our bravery debates, he actually says, so in that article, he discusses the fact that sometimes people need to hear different things. So maybe in some cases, Ayn Rand saying you need to be selfish is a good idea because you were raised in some religion that said you should never consider your own self. So that's exactly the right thing. But for everybody else, that's like not what they need to hear. In fact, it's probably even dangerous. And he's trying to explain that the message depends on the audience to some degree, that a lot of times we have these contradictory beliefs. You should be selfish. You should take care of yourself, and you should look out for other people. And they can both be true, but just in different circumstances and to different audiences. Based on that, he says, I feel pretty okay about being sort of a libertarian and writing an essay arguing against libertarianism, linked to this essay, because the world generally isn't libertarian enough. But the sorts of people who read long online political essays generally are way more libertarian than can possibly be healthy.
Yes. Yes, yes.
So what he actually advocates for in his manifesto is the kind of government interference he want, and it's beyond the scope. This would be like its own podcast, so I will not try to go too far into this. But like, for instance, imagine that there was racism against Martians. He uses Martians as the example to avoid offense. Maybe what you do is you pay people to hire Martians until you get to where they're not a disadvantage compared to humans. And he's imagining where the government actually affects the incentive system, but it's still solved by the free market. If you're racist against Martians, don't hire them. It's just you missed out on that extra money, or maybe you had to pay extra to hire a human. I can't remember which way he did it, but it would work the same either way, right? And so that you actually find ways to use government to create visibility to the market, then let the market solve the problem. And he argues that you could argue whether he's right or not, and he's just using an example anyhow. But he argues that if you actually wanted to get rid of racism, doing this would cause people to look more favorably upon Martians than trying to make a law against not hiring Martians because you're racist or whatever, right? Then you have to prove, no, it was by cause, and instead just let the market solve it, right? And he gives examples of how Muslims used to conquer a nation and say, you can still be Christian or Jewish if you want, but here's all these incentives, and everybody converts, of their own free will. And they feel like it's their free will. It's just the incentive system was structured such that.
That's a very interesting point. Yeah.
So he argues that if you really want to get rid of racism, you use the market to get rid of racism. But what he means is use the government to create an incentive so the market will solve the problem. So there's no incompatibility between governments and markets anymore. They are two different ways that are two different things that are both necessary, and together they can work together to solve problems.
That is such a good example of how libertarian thinking can be so valuable. So, libertarianism as applied to the problem of affirmative action is basically what he's talking about here. And whether or not that would work, like if we say, any employer who hires a Muslim will have 10% of their wages subsidized. But no, but I'm going to say no. Okay. Any employer, any employer who hires a Muslim will have 10% of the wage subsidy covered by the government. I could see immediately the problems with that kind of thing, but at least it's a new way to think about the question of affirmative action, say.
Right.
And so that is just a nice positive example of where libertarianism, if it's done in that fashion, I would have zero problem with it, trying to use market incentives to try to solve real world problems like discrimination in a bit of a different way. And whether or not it's going to work would take a lot more thinking and stuff, but at least it's a new angle on the problem.
Well, then he points out that you can then measure it. So the reason why we have so much concern about racism is this idea of subconscious racism, and we can do studies where we give the same resume to a person of one race versus a person of another race, and then the one race gets hired more than the other race. Okay, measure that, then make the adjustments, then measure it again and see that they don't have a disadvantage. Measure it again the next year. If it's starting to disappear on its own because people are getting used to it, then you reduce the subsidy and it's gone at some point, right? And so it's a brilliant idea. I mean, it's at least a brilliant idea worth trying. Whether it would work or not is a different question.
Sweet. So maybe what we should do, because this will be our last episode on the subject of libertarianism, is just a quick round of concluding thoughts about maybe what we talked about in this episode and in the whole series in general, and what we think the listeners' high-level takeaways should be, or what we hope they are. So
I think what I want to express is not a problem with libertarianism, if particularly since I kind of am a libertarian. I'm a Scott Alexander style libertarian, very strongly, in fact. Right? Don't know what to call myself, so I usually call myself a conservative. But small government conservative. And it's really nothing is wrong with libertarianism. I think libertarianism as a movement has done amazing amount of good in forcing us to think of things. Conservatives did not do a great job. Even small government conservatives did not do a great job making us really stop and think about, hey, could we let the market take care of that in a way that libertarians have been able to do? the reason why I have found myself bumping heads with libertarians is kind of a strange reason. And here's how I would summarize it. They are claiming knowledge on something that I know they can't possibly have knowledge of. They're claiming utopian claims. Obviously, this isn't all of them. In fact, it's not even most of them, since most libertarians are probably like me, just vaguely want less government, right? But in terms of the ones you bump into on the internet that say, I'm a libertarian, this is the overwhelming number of them, where they're making claims about utopian, I'm going to say it's utopian claims about how the best way to solve our problems must ultimately be that we do away with government because governments are coercive by definition. And they make a point of defining it so that it's tautologically guaranteed that governments count as coercive, which is wrong, in my opinion. And they're trying to make prophecies, and I think that's the correct term, as to what the future must look like based on what they claim are universal principles, which turns out what they mean by universal principles of economics, they mean a highly politically motivated school of economics known as Austrian economics. And they don't recognize any other school as having anything of value to add. I think that whole point of view deserves a very strong pushback because honestly, even if they were to turn out to be right, that someday we do move to a fully anarcho-capitalist society, they don't know that today, and it was still a prophecy, even if it turned out to be a true prophecy. And it still was wrong for them to make claims to having a best theory that was not, in fact, a best theory. And I actually think this is kind of an objective thing. Is Austrian economics a best theory of economics? No, that's a fact. I don't know what else to say, right? I mean, it is absolutely not a best theory in the Popperian sense of being a best theory. And if it is, then there's something drastically wrong with Popperian epistemology, and I want to get away from it as far as I can. Now, is it a good theory that taught us things? You know, economics doesn't have paradigm theories like physics. They've got lots of different schools, and we borrow those. We put all those into the graduate textbook at the end of the day, and the graduate textbook is the collection of best theories as far as we know at this point. Okay. A lot of that probably does come from Austrian economics. It is a valuable critique of many things in that sense. But like most politically motivated theories, it has high motivation to try to put itself inside of a bubble of irrefutability. And they, as far as I can tell, they are going to great lengths to put themselves into a bubble of irrefutability. And the crit rat version of it does that by using various Popperian terms that, in my opinion, cause you to misunderstand what Popperian epistemology was even all about. I think it actually not only disrupts your understanding of economics, it disrupts your understanding of Popperian epistemology to get too far into the crit rat version of Austrian economics. So that's where my pushback is. If we could drop that, if we could just say, look, let's talk about actual best economic theories, let's debate those, because this isn't physics. There usually are competitors. So we can talk about, should it be this or should it be that? And if we were actually doing that, and we were talking about, let's try to do more through the free market. We have a cultural problem where we do too much through government, and it causes problems. And we need to stop doing that. There are places where it makes sense to use government. We can now debate where those places are, and we can have policy debates over that. I would be totally on board with that version of libertarianism. In fact, I think it is the best political theory, personally, if we could actually look at it in that way. And we could drop kind of the nonsense around, we have a branch of physics, economics is, Austrian economics specifically is a branch of physics, and taxes are theft, and all these other things that honestly make these ideas look as foolish as they actually are. And if we were to just drop that, I understand they kind of give a moral motivation as a meaning meme. But as an actual good idea in the world that's going to make a difference, they are a net negative and they should be dropped. And if you understand Popperian epistemology, you will slice these out of your theories, because Popperian epistemology is a harsh mistress that will force you to slice them out of your theories and to get down to the parts that are actually true. And that's really what I'm trying to advocate here for. Having said that, I really feel like this almost forces me to be more negative on libertarianism than I honestly feel, right? Because it's just so obvious to me that we're going down one bad road after another politically, trying to get government to solve problems that to me seem like obviously we could have solved them using the market, and the market would have been way more efficient. And I'm very much I think if you could like give me the magic wand and I make my prophecies, let's go ahead and call them prophecies, of where I think would be more ideal, I think you'd be surprised how much I would slice out of the government, and try to get the free market to take it over. Probably to the point where most libertarians should rightly be seeing me as a strong ally that just simply doesn't want to put up with the nonsense side of the philosophy. That would probably be my summary and takeaway of the whole series at this point.
Damn, that's quite the thing to follow. Mine won't be as long. Maybe I'll just start by summarizing this section a bit, just for the listeners who are wondering what the hell we just talked about for the last hour and a half. So broadly, this section was about the competence of government, and then the competence of government with respect to some specific industries such as healthcare, education, and safety. We mostly talked about competence of government at a high level, and then the differences between political theories, economic theories, etc. I was less impressed with Scott's argumentation in this section than I think both of you were. I think it's a relatively naive libertarian position that says that government can't do anything ever. And that's basically the position that I took Scott to be arguing about in this section. And of course, that's not true. And so I don't view him as having sort of taken the best libertarian arguments and defeated them in this section. And so less impressed with this section, but still a great FAQ overall. I learned a lot. I think I came into it a little less averse to libertarianism than you both were, perhaps just because I spent less time arguing with them online. So I think you guys came in with something to prove about a certain flavor of online libertarianism that I didn't have. I, in fact, maybe came into it a little more libertarian curious, and continue to find that as I get older, especially, I become more libertarian curious. I don't know if that's just because of some inner streak of mild contrarianism in me and being in higher education when it's very rare to have people right of center. So I don't know if that's what's made me curious or just some previous jobs and stuff I've had in the past. But this, I think, served me overall as some sort of corrective to perhaps some more naive libertarian positions that are easy to adopt maybe reflexively against like stupid policies proposed by some people on the farther left. And so, I think I came at it from a different perspective than you both, but learned a lot. I'm still pretty libertarian curious with respect to specific questions, in particular, how they think about innovation and stuff. I think Scott's lack of compelling argumentation in this section made me more curious about how libertarians think about, like, for instance, the funding of basic research and whatnot. So if you're a libertarian and you've made it this far and want to reach out, I'd be pretty curious about that. I'm concerned alongside a lot of other folks right now about sort of the lack of, aside from like computer science, basically the lack of progress being made in a lot of areas. So I don't really know what's causing that, but if libertarians have potential solutions to that sort of slowing down of progress, I'm all ears. But overall, a great series. Learned a lot, and feel like I'm more knowledgeable both with respect to libertarianism and its opposites. And we probably spent more time on the epistemological aspects of libertarianism than lots of audience members were maybe comfortable with. But sorry, that's just our temperament, I think, at this point, and the shared background that we have. So that was sort of unavoidable, but hopefully that wasn't too difficult to deal with.
Yeah. So I guess, my concluding thoughts. So of the whole series, I was the one who proposed this 4-part series, and I was the one who suggested we go through Scott Alexander's piece. And so maybe just to conclude with just some comments about why I was interested in this subject in the first place.
Let the listener know that I had said I had said perhaps like a year or two previously, at some point we should cover libertarianism. Vaden kept going, I don't want to touch that subject with a 10-foot pole. So I would just like to go on record as saying I was suggesting this talk for a long time, but Vaden, I guess, is the man of the household. And so he determines what we're actually going to talk about. And so when he finally said we're going to talk about libertarianism, fine, then I guess we're going to talk about it. But
so, okay, no, that's an awesome point. And I absolutely did say that for a long time. And so why was I saying that and why did I change my mind, I think is worth discussing. So I am very interested in the study of ideology in particular. For whatever reason, that just seems to captivate me. And the libertarian subject, I was averse to talk about it for so long because I didn't know how to crack that nut. I didn't know how to talk about the subject without getting lost in a thicket of economic principles and details, which I was not equipped to handle. And so perhaps that's why we've kind of addressed this mainly from the epistemological lens, because once I started seeing how the Popperian ideas were being deployed in service of libertarianism, Popperianism I know decently well, and so that was my angle in. And so my aversion to talking about it was mainly because of how huge the subject is. And that kind of gets us a bit closer to this piece. And so I found this piece almost 10 or 15 years ago, or God, maybe 10 years ago. I think it was written in 2013 or 2012. And when I read it, I was like, okay, there's some interesting stuff here, but I had never encountered any libertarians in the wild. And so it was always just in my mental shelf of like, I might need to come back to this at some point. And then when I finally did encounter them, then all the stuff that he was writing about really kind of landed. And so this was the primary tool that I was using in conjunction with my background readings on Popper. And that's what flipped the switch for me that allowed me to start having an angle in that. And that's why I basically changed, figured I was well equipped now to start talking about it. So that's the switch, because I didn't want to start talking about something before I knew roughly the terrain, I guess. So I've said I'm interested in the study of ideology, but I need to also comment on the fact that not all libertarians are ideological, and both Bruce, yourself, and Ben have pointed out, and I think I pointed out as well, that there are a lot of libertarian thinkers and ideas that have come from libertarianism, which is awesome and which is great, and is just we're not attacking that. But with most ideologies, if not all, or most movements, what happens is you have kind of like the classic Mott and Bailey, or I would just rather say the good ideas get integrated into mainstream thought and are no longer associated with the ideology itself. And then what you're left with are just all the people who are holding on to all of the bad ideas, and they kind of form the outer crust of the quote ideology. And that's what's happening with libertarianism. And so why this particular piece? Well, I think that it was a great way to kind of chunk the major things that you could expect to encounter in a conversation with a libertarian at a bar, and break. And so that's how we tried to roughly structure this 4 episode series. So in the first episode, we talked about economic issues, and that's kind of going into some of the nitty gritty of economics, because libertarianism is a movement from the right, or at least the kind of libertarianism we're talking about here. And in particular, you need to know some basics of economics. So that's what the first section of the piece was, and the first episode in the series was about. No, I think we actually did moral then economic.
We did moral
that
first, yeah.
Pardon me. So I'm just going to go through the order in which Scott lays it out. We actually switched the order a little bit. Then in the social section, that's where you get to ideas like, if you're poor, is it because you haven't worked hard? And if you're rich, is it because you've worked really, really hard and you deserve all the benefits? And so that is a major component of libertarian thinking. And that's where we talked about social mobility. And that's where this idea that taxation is a bad thing kind of comes in quite strongly, because taxation from this view is taking from the rich and giving it to the poor, which is taking from the hardworking and giving it to the not hardworking. Then in this episode, we talked about political issues. And political issues now gets to the concrete things like, okay, is government always incompetent? Yes or no? How does government approach issues like healthcare, like private prisons, like gun control and education? We didn't go into those specifics, but I just wanted to plant a flag that for listeners, if they want to go into the details, there's a lot of great content that we didn't get there. But Ben's point is also needed to be heeded, which is that arguably Scott's not arguing against the strongest form of libertarian here. He's arguing against maybe just the more coarse libertarian that says the government always does bad. And then the moral issues component is where you get to things like the non-aggression principle, the word coercion, and that's the moral dimension. And so these four threads get jumbled up in this crazy ball of confusion where people will switch from economics to moral to political to social and back again in this crazy just ping pong style of argumentation where I think Scott Alexander named it the bait and switch technique. Or no, he called it bait and switch, and then I tried to formally name it that, where the bait and switch is you're arguing about practical stuff, and then you eventually convince them that practically it's not going to work. And then they switch to the moral issues, and they say, well, even if it doesn't work, it's just morally wrong to have government step in because that's coercion. And so that's the bait and switch to move from practical to moral. And then moving from moral back to practical, or if you argue that coercion isn't always wrong, then they'll switch back and they'll say, well, in practice, it doesn't actually work. And you just constantly get this switching effect. And so I'm interested in this subject from the perspective of how do you argue against it? And that's my main interest in most ideologies because they captivate a lot of people and you're likely to encounter this line of thinking in your life at some point. And so knowing how to understand it, to take away the good parts and keep those as valuable while being able to argue cogently against proponents of said philosophy is my main focus and my main interest in a lot of these discussions. And so that was what motivated the series. And that's what kind of changed my opinion from not wanting to touch the subject at all to wanting to dive in. And yeah, so in terms of takeaways, I hope the audience has learned a little bit about libertarianism through this series. But in particular, I hope that the audience will consider these 4 episodes as something to go back to when they encounter this stuff in the wilds. Because I think that if you haven't encountered it in the wild, then a lot of it will be like, why are they arguing about taxation and stuff? But at some point you will. And at that point, hopefully, you'll give these episodes a re-listen and you'll have just a new quiver of arrows to draw. What's the bow analogy? I don't know. To shoot when you're encountering these things in the wild. And so that's my high-level takeaway that I hope the audience has is just a giant flag plant of, okay, this is what I can use later if I encounter this stuff in the wild. And so, yeah, I don't know what we're going to talk about next, but it was so great having Mr. Bruce here to help guide us through. And so I just want to say thank you so much for all of the time and effort and thought that you put into this. And
dealing with Vaden's technical difficulties.
Oh, yeah, so many of them. So I just want to say a big thank you to you, Mr. Bruce. And any plugs? How do people find you? How do people find more of your work? How can we get all of our listeners to be your number one subscribed fans on the Theory of Anything podcast? Tell people where to find your stuff.
Yes, thank you for having me on. I am the host for the Theory of Anything podcast. So where would you find that? Well, probably the easiest way is I'm on Twitter, B Nielson, Nielson 01 on Twitter, and I will post it there. We also post it over in the Many Worlds of David Deutsch room in Facebook, which is a great page that's maintained by Peter, who's one of the co-hosts of Theory of Anything podcast. But we're found on Spotify and everywhere else. So there is more than one called the Theory of Anything podcast. I think ours is the one that usually comes up first, though. We cover a lot of different subjects related to kind of the original idea was to talk about David Deutsch's 4 strands, which is biological evolution, Karl Popper's epistemology, Many Worlds interpretation of quantum physics, and computational theory. We cover a lot about Karl Popper's epistemology. But my kind of real interest is I'm really curious about AGI and intelligence. And so I kind of came to this interest in David Deutsch's 4 strands more from the interest of this might actually be saying something useful about AGI, and I'd like to look into it further. So we cover tons of subjects just related to intelligence, animal intelligence, and things like that are kind of related to the 4 strands through that interest in AGI that's pretty common in that community. So I feel like we're slowly moving more towards stuff on intelligence. We got a whole bunch of podcasts coming out where we're going to talk about like Douglas Hofstadter's theories about intelligence, whether those are any good or not. Ken Stanley's myth of the objective, which I think is fascinating. The problem of open-endedness, we talked about with his also. So I feel like these are nerdy subjects, but I personally think they're super interesting. So I'm making a podcast about them, and everybody else can decide for themselves if they're is equally nerdily interested in this or not. So
yeah, to our listeners, if you're interested in the Deutschian stuff that we talk about, Bruce is often where I secretly get a lot of my ideas and then don't cite you. No, of course I do. But yeah, so that's one of my go-to places for a deep dive into those ideas. And so highly recommend it. And just one comment on Bruce's on Twitter. Yeah, you are certainly on Twitter, because every once in a while I'll wake up and have 75 little notifications on my Twitter. Because when Bruce tweets, you get a lot, and they're always fun and interesting.
It's a full blog post, just split up into little paragraphs.
Yeah, it's hilarious. So yeah, highly recommend following him as well. It's great. Anyways, thank you so much. I don't know what we're going to talk about next time, but this has been a total blast, and I feel hopefully the libertarian listeners we still have left are the good ones. No, I'm just kidding. They're all good ones. Yeah. So thanks again.
All right. Thank you.